Hi, my name is Amanda Panacea, and you're listening to the Healer Revolution podcast. This is a community for self-healers, biohackers, practitioners, and any other helping professionals. You're in the right place if you're seeking conversations about how pain becomes passion, the connection between physical, energetic, mental, and our spiritual self, finding your body's ancient wisdom, the latest biohacking technologies, clinical research, and if you just want to nerd out about complex biochemistry and quantum physics. But this is also for entrepreneurs who seek infinite abundance and a supportive community. So pour a cup of King coffee or Sisters tea and let's join the revolution. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Healer Revolution. I am Amanda Panacea, and today's guest is someone whose work really changed the way I approach understanding physiology. His name is Jack Schroder. He's a certified health coach and nutritionist who helps people restore their health through a systems-based root cause approach. He had his own journey, of course, like we all have one, trying to overcome anxiety, declining health, substance abuse like drugs and alcohol, hormonal dysfunction, and sleep apnea, which we touch base on in the podcast. And when I first found him, I was like, who is this guy? Because he didn't have any pictures. I had never seen anyone talk about him, but every single post and all of his content on social media was just so incredible, really well thought out. So I began following his work and started to notice that he has an incredible ability to connect biophysics and biochemistry to the point where he seems to have the entire metabolic pathway, all of the cofactors, the name of the enzymes, basically every cellular process memorized. And even after learning from many incredible, the best of the best teachers in my master's program in functional medicine, taking dozens of courses postgraduate degree, I have never seen anyone understand these systems and have them memorized quite like this. So today I wanted to go do a deep dive, of course, on the mitochondria and why it is so much more than just producing ATP. And so we talk about how ATP is just one out of dozens of things mitochondria are doing and how that relates from everything from complex chronic illness to anxiety and nervous system regulation. And we get into, how he healed and understanding after working with so many people, what are the most important levers and highest up processes that we need to support to make sure that other things downstream are going to be relevant. So I know you're going to enjoy this podcast. Take notes because it is going to be a really deep dive. Enjoy. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Healer Revolution podcast. I am Amanda Panacea, and today I am really excited to sit down with the health educator, Jack Schroder. Hi, Jack. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Amanda. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, I'm so excited to have you on because I found you on Instagram, and when I joined your school, which is essentially like a platform, I guess, to host like all of your content, your webinars, I was blown away. But as someone who has had a lot of formal education, I've had a lot of mentors, I've had a lot of teachers, I feel like you are like top tier with how you can bring together biochemistry, bioenergetics, mental health, like just everything all into one space. And I'm so excited to sit down and I get to have a conversation of like, how did you learn all of this stuff and how did you get here? Because I highly recommend your school to all the practitioners that I talk to.
Well, I really appreciate that on many levels. And I think around the whole learning side of things, I it's more just a passion more than anything. And I think it just comes down to if you enjoyed learning it, you should just continue to do that. And that's what I did. I think I've definitely got a long way to go in terms of other people in the space and how much amazing information they're putting out. But yeah, I appreciate that you think so highly of my school and you recommend it to others. I think that's amazing. So thank you so much.
Yeah, of course, you're welcome. Because I feel like people fall into certain camps. Either they know a lot about biochemistry, or they know a lot about how to read a certain test, or they know a lot about bioenergetics, or like they're the quantum biology people. But we have to bring it all together. And I feel like, no, I have not found a single person that does that as well as you. So I am really excited to talk about one of my favorite topics is our mitochondria and why that is like at the root of all these diseases. I'm sure you have people that come to you and they're like, "Well, what about my liver? What about my thyroid?" And you're like, "We got to start up here with the mitochondria. We have to start with these inputs that are needed to have our cellular metabolism working smoothly, and those other things are going to kind of fall into place later." But before we get into that, I'd love to hear your story. Like, why did you get so obsessed with learning about health? I'm sure you have like a pain to passion story of some sort.
Yeah, so I tend to obsess over stuff. That's just who I am. And some obsessions previously were probably not great obsessions. So one big period of my life was drugs and alcohol, and there was arguably some normalized addictions going on there, and that was probably one of the biggest contributors to the decline in my health. Also, video games and like addiction to porn, junk food, like all of these things started to compound together. And obviously, you'd consider those not great like passions or addictions to have. And that's where probably around 25, 26, I'm almost 31 now, is where my health started to really decline around COVID time. And I think there was just a synergistic effect of me waking up to the reality of what the world actually is, and how we have just been puppeted by big pharma, big food, big tech, and so on to essentially be controlled and put into place in terms of where they want us to be, not be aware of anything that is going on so they can make profits and just be in control, basically. So I had some pretty decent health issues then, like low testosterone. Uh, I had the addiction side of things, some gut issues, definitely. There's even stuff that I'm still somewhat dealing with now. I'm starting to unpack a little bit more and understand. So, for example, like I have a mild form of sleep apnea called upper airway resistance syndrome. I have postnasal drip that I'm still dealing with and sort of neglected it. But now I'm starting to become more aware of these things and starting to do more like deeper biohacking and testing around that. But that's essentially what kickstarted it is my health issues 5 to 6 years ago. And one of my friends was doing the carnivore diet. And I was just like, what the fuck? Like, that sounds like insane to be doing something like that. And then the more he spoke about it, the more I was intrigued. And I think that's what really started was that, and that was around COVID as well, is when I started to really dive into just things that weren't recommended whatsoever by any medical practitioner and hearing these anecdotes and these results, I tried it and it didn't work as well for me, but I will say I didn't do it properly. But it definitely just allowed me, kind of like a catalyst to open my mind to other things beyond what the food pyramid encompasses or what your general practitioner actually says to you about your lab work and anything in between related to health.
Yeah. So where did you start? Like, how did you know where to start?
I don't think I did, to be honest. Like, I think I found people online and they were sharing some very valuable information. I read a few books. So I think a few that stuck with me was Breathe by James Nestor, if you've read that, Deep Nutrition by Catherine Shanahan, Circadian Code by Sachin Panda. Like, I read all these health books. And to be honest, I don't really read books anymore. I'm kind of more of a PubMed kind of guy. But I that's probably what started as well, is just absorbing as much information as I can, being obsessed with it, listening to podcasts as well. And then as I continued to do that, I think I just started to formulate some of my own ideas and thinkings. But to be honest with you, I think a lot of it was inspired by other people. And maybe I have the ability to kind of combine all of those together and try and have like like an unbiased, non-dogmatic approach to it. So yeah, I think it was just, I didn't know where to start per se. I just dove in and essentially just hoped for the best. It was a blessing that AI was out at the time as well, where again, I didn't do any I wasn't good at science when I was in school. I wasn't interested in it. I was okay at maths. But that's sort of where the line of like biology sort of drew in the sand, or science in general. But and I came from like a trade background, so electrical background, which is something that can be leveraged. But I I think AI at that time was also really useful because you can use it just in the sense of understanding basic biochemistry or basic physics and anything like that that can be leveraged that isn't super in depth. You can learn those concepts. And as I continued to learn that, I started to piece things a little bit more together. And as you know, with like the learning journey, you just, the more that learned, the more that I realized I don't know anything. Like, to be honest with you,
Yeah.
just for example, recently I've just been learning about the thymus gland and immune pathways a little bit more in depth, and I'm just like, wow, like there's so much even to learn around this, and I could dedicate my whole
Mm.
life learning about this, and I wouldn't even be able to comprehend all of it. So yeah, it's one of those things where you stay a bit humble. You have the Dunning-Kruger effect constantly. You don't get stuck in your own beliefs, which is something that I did when I definitely dove into like the whole circadian quantum side of things, because I thought that was the be all end all. But then I realized that there's a lot more going on in our biology to grasp. So yeah, I started from there, and then I just continued to try and like compound more information on and try and differentiate what is worth diving into and what isn't, and essentially trying to build on what other people have their own theories and their own ideas, and essentially try and, as you said, try and bring it all together as well with maybe my own little flavor on top.
Yeah, because I mean, I've had two master's degrees. I've probably done, gosh, 200 weekend training certifications. Plus, then when ChatGPT came out, and I've checked a lot of your stuff, and I was like, I've never heard of that before, and I've never everything that I've learned from you. I'm like, that checks out. So, I mean, you talk about some of the big names as like maybe some of your mentors, like Dr. Jack Cruz and Doug Wallace, and like it, 10 years ago, those people weren't around. So I feel like maybe the time you came in, also maybe you were easy to find those people. Because I mean, you could see the shift in like 2018 to 2020 into like quantum biology is everything out of biochemistry and detox from heavy metals and detox from mold. There was like a really big shift in like approaches. But again, like you said, even quantum biology, even as amazing and in depth and important as it is, like I work with so many people who that only got them so far. Okay, well, what are we missing?
Me
Right?
too.
Like, okay, there's more. There's gotta be more. Your lifestyle is perfect. So what else are we missing? Right? And I think you even mentioned that you moved like where there's no EMFs anywhere. Something was still missing, right?
Oh, 100%. And that's another thing. So before I started my business about 3 or so years ago, I I tried to save up as much money as I could, and then I went traveling to try and find the perfect place. And
Mhm.
I probably went to about, I don't know, 15 to 20 spots over the last 3 years, maybe a bit more. And there's always a trade-off wherever you go. Like, sure, as you said,
Yeah.
I went to an island that was volcanic, that had extremely low EMFs, and was deeply connected to nature. But then I felt very isolated socially. It was stressful to kind
Yeah.
of be there. So, and then wasn't like a good gym or facilities there, and then access to like there was no supermarket there. Like there was, but it was terrible. So yeah,
Yeah.
there's just trade-offs to everywhere you go. And I agree with you, Amanda, around clients, because when I first started taking on clients, maybe like within a year or so, I started to realize my easy cases worked really well for the circadian stuff, and diving into all the fundamentals. But then more complex cases, it doesn't move the needle enough. And the reason is because the modern world has just caused so much dysregulation in the body to essentially drive things like autoimmune conditions, gut infections, and dysbiosis, nervous system issues, neuropsychiatric disorders, whatever it is, where sunlight and darkness is foundational. And you can kind of think of the fundamentals. And when I talk about that, we're talking about sleep, breathing, mindset, hydration, all of these really core concepts. Like I think of that as like the 80-20 rule. I know that people like to throw 80-20s around, but that's kind of just, it's not like a definitive number, but 80%
Hmm.
is catered to that. But then you still need that 20% of like bio individuality based on their needs. And that's where you dive into things like their lab work, addressing the weak areas of that, diving really deep into their symptoms, their micronutrients, um, trying to formulate the perfect protocol for them on top of the foundations that they have to allow them to essentially move forward because that 80% doesn't work without the 20, in my opinion. And that 20% doesn't work without the 80. So they need to combine together
Yeah.
synergistically in order for someone to really resolve issues. Because again, like I think like a prime example here, and I think you might have had mast cell activation. Quote me if I'm wrong, right?
I did. Yeah.
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 So again,
Mouth activation, head to toe eczema, and topical steroid
yeah.
withdrawal.
So
Yeah.
it's just like sunlight and
Brutal.
darkness and eating seasonally is only going to do so much. And even then, like eating
Right.
seasonally might actually be detrimental, especially if there's a gut infection, right? And we think about if there's a
Mhm.
bacterial overgrowth or something like that, and you're eating seasonally, but you're eating FODMAPs, and the FODMAPs are feeding the opportunistic bacteria, and then your gut is never able to heal. You've got 70 to 80% of your immune system that sits behind your gut. Therefore, that's essentially playing a really big role in training what your mast cells actually do and how they respond. And then you have this mast cell activation syndrome. And then even on top of that, you've got inflammatory mediators that drive the HPA axes and cause complete dysregulation, leading to things like cortisol resistance, which that's where you have to actually seek a pharmaceutical glucocorticoid to try and mitigate the chronic eczema that you're experiencing. So yeah, there's even nuance to that. And that's why I think like the bio
Mhm.
individuality is just so important because not one person is the same. And that's where like we can get really stuck into people who have protocols or ways of eating. And it could be amazing for one person, but then it could be absolutely detrimental and problematic for another.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's start to switch gears into actual mitochondria because like I work with predominantly people experiencing like mast cell activation, autoimmunity, severe inflammation, really high sensitivity levels to the point where they might be really sensitive to light or the sun, or they can't almost take any supplements. So I have to be really, really like methodical and very what's the word I'm looking for? Careful, I guess, with what we start with. And so this is why I like to look at obviously the foundations, the light environment, whatever we can low hanging fruit we can tackle. I'm also a licensed therapist, so I do a lot of like emotional support and nervous system regulation. But when it comes to nutrients or bottlenecks, I'm always looking at mitochondria. Like, what are we missing here? So, could you explain why that's so important and why, if we don't have some of the key inputs for mitochondrial function, that it's going to downstream have an effect on all these other symptoms, including the immune system, the nervous system, you name it, the organs?
Yeah, so I think the core component is that mitochondria, like you hear this there's a meme around it that mitochondria are the powerhouse of the cell.
Yeah.
And that's essentially what they are, but obviously they do a lot more than that. But I think it is really important to hone in on that because that's diving deep into the whole biophysics and quantum side of things because energy essentially governs everything. And like the universe, we can be naturally in our body and our biology and everything that surrounds us naturally wants to go into disorder, and that's due to the second law of thermodynamics. So, what essentially happens is we need energy invested into the system to allow it to be organized. And that organization is found on like the atomic, molecular, and even the optic level. So, that's like more in the AMO physics side of things. And you can kind of think of that where order, the opposite of order is chaos. And you can think of pretty much every single disease as like chaotic, right? So mast cell activation syndrome is chaos. Schizophrenia is chaos in the nervous system. It's just like different nodes of the network that are affected. And the ability to, because obviously we don't just have energy, like we need it to be leveraged. and utilized efficiently. And this is where we can look at like the biochemical side of things, but also the biophysical side. So we'll start with the biophysical side. So if we look at that, the main inputs are going to predominantly be like grounding and sunlight and essentially water, and how water has the ability to send energy and information throughout the system through the exclusion zone that is built by it. And then what else does it surround? It surrounds basically every single protein, cell membrane, and anything in between. So, like as an example, you can classify those as technically semiconductors. So, like collagen, melanin, DHA. There's many. Even just proteins in general are going to have semiconductive properties, and that within itself, the water acts as like the glue of communication to essentially send either electricity, protonicity, or even things like vibrations and solitons through the network of our cells, of our tissues, for ultimate communication and coherence. So that's like the biophysical side. Now, if we go to the biochemical side, which ties directly in with like the biophysics as well, is that the mitochondria are converting energy from food predominantly into usable biochemical energy. And then at the same time, they're doing a bunch of other things throughout the electron transport chain and inside the TCA cycle. So there's things like making carbon dioxide, which can be utilized to enhance oxygen release via the Bohr effect, and also be a precursor to something called bicarbonate, which is also very important as like an acid-base bufferer. Then we also have the uh, water made by the reduction of oxygen at cytochrome C oxidase at complex 4. And that water is predominantly going to be intracellular, but obviously water is osmotic. So the water essentially in our extracellular space is still going to be influenced by what is being going on internally inside our cells. And that turnover of water, and because of the nature of the proton gradient, it's predominantly going to be low in deuterium. Therefore, the water is going to be deuterium depleted, which is very valuable. You can see how much 25 parts per million deuterium depleted water actually is. So if our biology can actually make that when we are in a healthy, coherent state, that is just hugely beneficial. And that, as I said, that water is the glue that connects basically everything for ultimate communication and coherence. So we have that. And then at the final step, we have the actual protons going through down their concentration gradient back into the matrix, which is going to make ATP. And then that ATP also has some huge effects around being the biochemical energy currency of the cell. So essentially, what I'm trying to tell you with this is that the mitochondria are absolutely foundational to allow for energy and order to occur within ourselves, in our cells, for us to essentially be in a healthy, optimal state where our thymus knows what our pineal gland is doing. Our gut knows what our nervous system is doing. There's like this communication on that level, but then even like within that, there's communication just within that tissue. So, for example, like how does one hepatocyte know how to do induce fatty acid oxidation, but then the other one, like how does the other one know? So there's like this coherence within that, and then there's obviously the coherence within the cell for the actual cell and the organelles to communicate efficiently. Even things on top of that is like the biophotons that are emitted from that as well. And again, like there's still a bit of murky research around it, but we could argue that the speed of light is one of the fastest ways of communication, especially when we have definitive wavelengths that are probably dictating the absorption and emission of certain molecules inside our body. So there's that component as well. We have reactive oxygen species and nitrogen species, which are also playing like a communication role on top. So the mitochondria are just converting that glucose, fatty acids, and even amino acids into signaling and into energy and order to enable us to thrive, essentially.
Yeah. Okay, that was a lot. But you touched on so many good points and things that I love to talk about with clients. So everyone I think at this point has heard, okay, we need energy to run like the rest of the body to work. I love how you also brought up that it's also about the communication between everything too, and that deuterium depleted exclusion zone water. And this is why, like when you tell someone, oh, you're most likely dehydrated, it's way bigger than just you need to drink more water. Like if it's showing up on your blood work, that's a sign that maybe you are not producing that exclusion zone water as well. And then another one of my favorite topics is that carbon dioxide. So, as someone who has struggled with this personally, my carbon dioxide and blood work was always low, always, always, always like 20, sometimes 19. And when I first got the Oura ring, my HRV was like 20, also really, really terrible. And my breathing rate was super fast. And I was like, oh, wow, thank God I got this Oura ring so I can figure this part out because I realized that I was breathing off all that carbon dioxide. And that was like part of my picture of maybe mitochondria not getting oxygen or part of that nervous system dysregulation where it was just subclinical. Like I didn't feel super stressed, but my posture, my breathing, all of that was contributing to maybe the mitochondria not getting what they need. So I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about carbon dioxide for a bit and like how important that is. I actually have a whole giant book sitting here. It's like, I
On
don't know
carbon
if you've
dioxide.
seen this book. Yeah.
Nice.
I'm trying to get through it, but it's one of those things that you're like, oh, this the way that you breathe, like you already brought up breathing before, the way that you sit, like sitting on a computer all day, the way that your posture is, the stress that you're experiencing through like how fast you're breathing impacts the carbon dioxide, and then how does carbon dioxide then impact the rest of that mitochondrial process?
Yeah, I think you mentioned a few important points there that I wanted to dive into. So let's start with the whole posture side of things because I think that is really important and very relatable to most people. Because there's things like they call it. I just found this out the other day, but like text neck. So like
Tech
you
neck, yeah.
obviously yeah tech neck. So you've got that. Tech neck is probably more relatable. I think I heard text neck, but tech
Video
neck sounds
game,
better. Yeah. So like tech neck,
probably both,
obviously.
yeah.
Yeah, like hunched over shoulders, lack of movement, like sedentary lifestyle. So that's
Hmm.
obviously going to correlate to sluggish lymphatic flow, tight fascia, probably poor blood flow on top. And you've got to think like those systems. If we think of that like an engineer, like that is very significant. What could be happening? And if we zoom back into the mitochondria are reliant on this constant influx of oxygen to be reduced. And whenever anything of like that bottlenecks, that's where we start to see problems, and that's where we start reprogramming the cell and the tissue itself, and even the whole system to accompany that. And obviously, you see that on the level of like genetic transcription factors like HIF-1 alpha, which is going to essentially reprogram the cell away from mitochondrial function and actually using that despite having oxygen readily available because it's not safe to actually burn it or combust it, should I say. And then we also have on like the nervous system level things like catecholamines that can drive like the sympathetic response. So anything that can compromise that is a really big deal. So I'll give you a few examples. Bottlenecks in energy metabolism. If we lack B vitamins, certain B vitamins, say like riboflavin as an example, coenzyme Q10, copper, uh, or anything upstream, that's just the electron transport chain. But anything related to those nutrients, or even I'll give you another example. This is how like nuanced it is that coenzyme Q10 is made from tyrosine, and it also requires part of the cholesterol pathway called mevalonate. And then we also need methylation to actually a methyl group to actually build coenzyme Q10. So we have to think, right, if there's anything that is compromising that, then we compromise our ability to reduce oxygen. And when we compromise our ability to reduce oxygen, we create excessive reactive oxygen species, accumulation of certain metabolites like succinate, which is reflective of complex 2 activity. Therefore, we get this hypoxic signaling. Now, I this is more of a hypothesis on my end, but I strongly predict that because of our chronic inability to use oxygen, and I might give one more example here, but like things like non-native EMFs and blue light and the lack thereof, like infrared light, which is obviously very different to indoor lighting, and that has the ability to optimize mitochondrial function, whereas the other two do the opposite. But I hypothesize that the lack of oxygen that we can utilize, our body's just trying to do the best it can with what it has. And we're trying to essentially downgrade the system to accompany that. And I think that that downgrade is not just on a structural level where we're literally breathing in less oxygen and expelling more CO2. There's probably some deeper things going on in the kidneys around acid base balance because that's related to bicarbonate. Then I also think we see it on the biophysical level where we don't make melanin properly. We don't. Our fascia is tight, and our fascia is tight maybe for a reason of like the inability. Well, for one thing, is like the inability to shuttle energy and information, but like that is the cost of our ability to not leverage energy for what we're meant to as a thriving human being. So I just think that's like a really important point there that you mentioned is that I think our body is like bioelectrically downgrading its hardware. So you can kind of think of that like power lines where we're injecting like a huge voltage into a wire that, well, sorry, that's probably not the greatest analogy there, but you can kind of think of it like power lines because that's just my way of thinking of it. But like the wire lacks the ability to actually handle the load. So therefore you decrease the load and you decrease the wire's capacity to handle that load. So that's how I think of what is going on with that. Now, to your second point, I think so. The other thing that you mentioned as well is like the bicarbonate low on a blood test, and that can definitely reflect mitochondrial output. But as you said, it can also reflect it can reflect the exhalation of dioxide as well. So the actual removal of it. And I would say there's two main reasons why that would occur. The first one is that carbon dioxide is when it reacts with the water and then later down the line it will form carbonic acid and then bicarbonate and a proton. So essentially if you go do that in reverse and you're expelling carbon dioxide, you're essentially expelling acidity indirectly or like the catalyst for driving acidity. So there's that. And then the other thing around carbon dioxide depletion or depleting it through the lungs is that I mentioned it a little bit earlier, but there's something called the Bohr effect, where we have a build up of protons in the lungs that bind to the red blood cells, which drives lower affinity for oxygen to bind to hemoglobin, and then the oxygen gets released, and then it can diffuse into the mitochondria. And provided that we have like the magnetic signal of the ATPase spinning, which is predominantly driven by infrared light, the oxygen will go there and essentially get reduced into deuterium depleted water. So those are like the two biggest components around what we see in the modern world where carbon dioxide is being chronically expelled. And I would say those two those two are the main reasons. But then also on top of that, like carbon dioxide has some other unique effects. So when we clear it in that regard, we can't use it as it's actually an antioxidant, not directly like a true electron donor, but it does induce chemical reactions with certain free radicals to essentially neutralize them. And then at the same time, it's also a vasodilator. So we're losing those capabilities. And you could even argue that we're intentionally vasoconstricting because we also need less oxygen. Maybe even on a blood test, when we see low red blood cells, low hemoglobin, and again, like obviously that can be a bit of a mismatch around, you could say a little bit high, but it may not be high. It could literally be dehydration, as you were mentioning before, because like there's less water in the actual plasma itself. But let's just say we take that into consideration, but then we see it still like a little bit low. Maybe that's like an adaptation for trying to essentially yoke or couple ourselves to how much oxygen we can actually handle on a chronic basis. So those are the things that I consider when I think about these gases and how they kind of interact with each other, especially oxygen and carbon dioxide. Another one that's also really important is nitric oxide, which I think everyone has a rough idea what that does. And obviously it's found in different forms. It can be in antimicrobial form. It can be found, which is ionos. It can be a neurotransmitter or a gasotransmitter, but then it can also be a vasodilator. And that nitric oxide is also really important for proper oxygen release and utilization. And that also is driven by UV light from sunlight. So that is a really core component. Otherwise, it's from cold exposure. So you think if someone's avoiding the sun or under an air conditioner in a comfortable environment, then they're compromising that. Therefore, they're compromising their ability to release that oxygen. And then you think, well, if we zoom out again, we think, well, that kind of makes sense because we don't want to be releasing that oxygen if it's unsafe to do so. So these are the things that I try and think about and try and piece together with the blood work and understanding mitochondrial biology. And I'm actually doing like fair few biohacks on myself quite soon that is going to even go deeper around all of this stuff and what we're speaking about, which will be good.
Mhm. Yeah. So you mentioned you struggle with sleep apnea. My fiance has the worst sleep apnea of all time. It has been like my life goal to help him reverse this. And it's much better than when we first met, because he's healthier now. And, when I first met, it was like, oh, your jaw's misaligned. But, and especially after watching your sleep apnea like lecture in school, I was like, oh, it's actually probably his lifestyle starting at a young age. Like he drank Coca-Cola in infancy, basically. And that metabolic health really, because we actually in Bangkok, we went to a sleep apnea doctor and he said, oh, your tongue is way too large. That's what's causing it. And I was like, you know what? It's probably insulin resistance causing the tongue to be larger, carrying more fat or in that muscle. Because I can kind of tell like when he works out, when he goes to sleep early versus like stays up late or plays video games after dark, it's worse. And like because I'm sleeping with him, I can tell. So I'm kind of interested in like how obviously how that is going to affect those gases if you have even mild sleep apnea, and then what kind of breathing techniques can somebody do like it's not supplement related, because I think that's like the learning how to breathe was one of the best things that I learned how to do for all of
Mm.
these like mechanisms and feedback loops.
Yeah, sleep apnea is quite interesting. And
Yeah.
my form technically isn't sleep apnea, but it's still where I can wake up anywhere between 10 to 20 times a night. And it's
Yeah.
my tongue essentially preventing myself from breathing. And I still chronically snore.
Mhm.
But I think it's still very relevant pathology. And
Yeah.
some of the connections around it is quite interesting because I think there's many layers. And one interesting paper I found recently is that people with obstructive sleep apnea have lower levels of serum lactate. So that's actually one of the things I'm going to be testing is I got a lactate meter. And I'll be
Okay.
testing that alongside glucose and ketones, oxygen saturation of hemoglobin, and then also just overall sleep stats and HRV. And I'm just going to see what works and what doesn't. So I'm going to be trying things like deuterium depleted water. I'm going to be trying. I'm obviously going to be doing deeper tests like organic acids and genetic testing and stuff like that. That is going to encompass more of a picture around what is going on. But yeah, that's the stuff that I'll be trialing around it, and I'm just going to see what my serum or my baseline lactate levels are because I would say that's a very good indicator around what is going on at the mitochondrial level because we kind of go back to what I was saying with pyruvate. Well, glucose forms pyruvate, and then pyruvate will go into the mitochondria via something called pyruvate dehydrogenase, which requires B1, B2, B3, B5, and magnesium and lipoic acid. And if there is a bottleneck due to hypoxia, that won't get shunted through essentially. And therefore, the pyruvate will form lactate. And then at the same time, that's going to regenerate NAD positive in the cytosol to allow glycolysis to keep going because we have to use some sort of bioenergetic system, despite it being inefficient. So, my hypothesis around that is that so firstly, if my baseline lactate is high, then there's obviously something going on at that level, potentially. There's either a bottleneck higher up, there's something that's stopping me from utilizing oxygen, uh, and it may just be a bottleneck in energy metabolism that is leading to the issues there. Now, if I try and do all of that stuff and I cross-reference my organic acid tests and everything in between, and I realize that it's not really on the mitochondrial level specifically around that, then and let's just say my lactate doesn't change, then I'm more prone to looking at the sleep apnea side of things and thinking of it more of a structural issue or potentially related to the integrity of the nerves that innervate, like the diaphragm or the intercostal nerves that essentially allow us to breathe. Could be related to anywhere in the brainstem, tongue posture. So even things like the facial nerve or the accessory nerve, I believe, is what innervates like the tongue and where that sort of sits. But then also the other things would be like the fascia, the integrity of that allows us to breathe properly, the sinus microbiome and like the ENT microbiome, so ears, nose, and throat, like any sort of local inflammation there may cause issues. So then I'd be really honing in on those, and I'll be able to give you like really good answers to whether that works or not specifically for me. So uh, And then obviously I'll be trying things. I think you asked about breath work, and that those are the things I'd be trying as
Yeah.
well, like deeper levels of breath work, maybe coupling that to doing more deeper biomechanical work with someone where I'm really releasing the tension in my neck or potentially even in my hips, because obviously there's fascia bands and slings that essentially can like tightness, because it's all like a tensegrity system. There could be tightness, say, in a part, even a part of your foot or your calf that is pulling tension
Yeah.
down and lacking the ability to fully expand your diaphragm to the pelvic floor, or just your ability to breathe through your nose or something like that. Even like tongue posture as well. There's a fascia band that runs all the way through from the tongue tie all the way down, I believe, and that's one of the treatments for that is to literally cut the tongue tie, but not considering why
Yes.
there's a problem with that all of a sudden in baby like the modern world, and like you see a lot of babies actually getting their tongue tied as a choice by the parents. So not sure if that answers your question, but I think it's very multifactorial in the sense of what is going on. And just to summarize that, if I address all the mitochondrial bottlenecks that may be causing dysregulated levels of lactate, glucose, ketones, pyruvate in the blood predominantly, uh, then that's where I'm going to be honing in a lot more around all the other stuff that I just mentioned, and it may actually be a problem specifically to that. And that's obviously where it gets a little bit
Mhm.
more complex because it's probably more trial and error. I'm just have to cross-reference with my symptoms, right? Like post-nasal drip, probably slightly clogged sinuses, and probably biofilms in the nasal cavity. Uh, Mouth breather my whole life. So it'd essentially be reverse engineering those things and seeing if that helps with improvements around status. So that's something that I've been doing.
Yeah.
Not sure if that answered your question completely, but the breathwork stuff, just to uh, summarize what I would do for that. I think
Yeah.
it works in synergism with myofascial release, and then it would be running something like a CO2 retention type breathing, where you're really focusing on relaxing the shoulders, expanding the diaphragm to the pelvic floor, and in all across all areas of the lower torso, and doing that for say anywhere between 10 to 20 minutes daily minimum.
Yeah. Yeah. I just finished a technique. It's called postural restoration with a coach. It was like a 7 month, like it's like a very niche physical therapy type coaching, I guess. And I it really helped with like my rib cage and diaphragmatic breathing in a way that my HRV is triple what it was a couple years ago.
There you go.
And when we first moved in like 9 months ago, we had just gone back from traveling. I felt horrible. Vietnam had really flared a lot of asthma for me, and I could barely walk up the stairs. And now, because I can breathe so much better, like everything, all my muscles, I guess, hold my posture differently. I can run up the stairs fine. And I'm not stronger. It's like my nervous system and the way that it's holding everything is more balanced. So it's pretty wild
Mm.
on top of like some body work and stuff like that too. But yeah, I oftentimes will recommend figuring out your Bolt score because most of my clients are fast breathing, over breathing. They were like me, they can barely hold their breath. They have POTS or air hunger constantly. And that's one of those like really easier, lower hanging fruit things that doesn't require a supplement, right? Like let's figure out how to breathe a little bit better, how to do diaphragmatic breathing or carbon dioxide retention to move that needle without a supplement. Lastly, well, maybe not lastly, but the next thing I kind of wanted to talk about is calcium. I love calcium. It's probably one of my favorite minerals besides zinc, and how our mitochondria are regulating calcium, but also how calcium and the cell danger response influence each other. Because I think in the chronic illness space, at this point, most people have heard cell danger response, and I get a lot of questions. How do I come out of cell danger response?
Yeah, got you. So, and I think what you mentioned about the posture stuff as well, I just wanted to leave a comment with that
Mhm.
is that with your remarkable improvement with the HRV and doing the body work and improving your breathing, like I think this is another prime example where if you do the fundamentals, it's not really going to resolve or move the needle if that's like a really big factor in terms of compromising your health. So just want to emphasize like how important it is to go really broad spectrum around all of these concepts, because if you blindside yourself by just going really deep into a topic, you may move the needle a little bit. And I think there's probably like a mindset component to that. But then obviously, if you're neglecting all the other stuff or not truly diving into it as much as you deserve, your body deserves, then that's where you're just not going to get as far from a health standpoint as you could be. So as extreme as it is and as broad spectrum can be quite overwhelming, it is really needed, in my opinion, in order to thrive.
Yeah.
But obviously, again, it's something that just slowly unpacks over time and you just learn everything as you go as well. So then that's essentially what I try and do in school is just like have all of these topics because they're all important as one another. Even if it compromises my ability to be like an expert at a certain topic, I try and cover everything. But so
No,
you asked about
you're
calcium
good.
in the cell danger response.
Yeah, like how calcium metabolism shifts and how that might show up like symptom wise and affects the rest of the body.
So, so to be honest, I don't know a ton about this, besides calcium as like a signaling molecule that will arguably govern excitatory cell signaling. So what do you mean by the metabolism side of things?
Like how calcium will flood into the cell and kind of help to harden or stiffen those cell walls so that like ATP production is downregulated. The cell is kind of in that like we are under threat.
No, I got you. Okay. Yeah, interesting. I actually haven't heard about the calcium playing a role in terms of it sounds like it's doing some sort of cement or concreting sort of role. All I was aware of was that the calcium is going to drive the signal. And again, this is really interesting because for one, calcium driving the signal is going down its concentration gradient, just like protons are going down their concentration gradient in the mitochondria. It's just at like the concentration of that, it's way less of a potential energy barrier, or should I say, like a membrane voltage between the two, but it has the ability to shift the voltage inside the cell. And that is what essentially drives the signal. And like then we think about, well, what is regulating the calcium? One thing is like the minerals themselves, so phosphorus, magnesium, zinc to a degree as well, iron, depending on where we're looking in the body, and like if we're looking about like from a transporter standpoint, and then even heavy metals, so like lead can compete with calcium, and obviously lead is bigger, like atomic, like the atomic mass of lead is bigger, so that's obviously going to have an influence there. But the calcium driving this, so just to talk about that concentration gradient there, then again, it comes back to energy and how that regulates the flow of ions coming in and out. And if we lack the energy, so let's just say we do have a signal that is caused by calcium, what essentially happens is because there's more calcium on the outside of the cell compared to the inside, what occurs is that the calcium goes inside, and again, it may actually be from like the certain specific organelles inside inside the cell as well. So, like for example, in muscle contraction, that's essentially what happens with the I think it's called the sarcoplasmic reticulum. But calcium floods in essentially inside the cytosol, and that drives a shift in membrane voltage and causes the signal itself to essentially drive biochemical reactions. So that's all good and well. But then to actually put that calcium back where it needs to go to run another signal and essentially turn the signal off, we need energy to invest into that, right? So you can kind of think of the analogy where if you if you've ever used methylene blue inside water, the methylene blue when you put a dropper into the water, it doesn't just like sit there in like a little globule and like concentrate itself. It wants to spread out. And that's how we tie in about like entropy and order and disorder, talking about energy needing to like concentrate stuff. That's essentially what's going on. So what I'm trying to say here is that if we have a signal, like an abrupt signal from calcium or sodium or potassium even leaving the cell, then we need energy to essentially put it back where it needs to be, and to essentially shut down that signal. And I think that's a really big component around the cell danger response is that if there's any sort of stress, and I'm not just talking about mental or psychosocial, psychological stress here, but any form of stress has the potential to induce the cell danger response, and therefore uh, the cell and potentially adjacent cells and so on will go in a protective state, kind of what I was saying before around preventing mitochondrial use, and therefore we lack energy. And we can even layer on what you said around the cell membrane becoming more tight and rigid, where probably the actual energy and information that gets sent through the system and the ability to harness energy from its adjacent environment is compromised. Therefore, we can't essentially shut off that signal until it's fully resolved. And you can kind of think of the cell danger response in a way, like I'm just thinking of this now, it ties into certain theories out there, like as cancer, where the cell almost loses communication with the rest of the body and thinks it's on its own, and therefore it's trying to chronically hyperproliferate to essentially because we don't want we're in survival mode even at the cellular level. So anyway, with the cell danger response and what you're talking about specifically, I don't know much about like the actual calcium on the membrane side of things, but I think the signal because it works within the mitochondria, works within the cytosol, is a huge deal. And as long as that signal gets shut off and it's clean and coherent, that's great. And if it's chronic and overactivated, that's when we can fall into like a ton of problems. And obviously, calcium is one of you can see it in neurons where sodium channels open by like a neurotransmitter or even by, say, something like, well, more so for calcium, but non-native electromagnetic fields, predominantly like in the RF radio frequency range. And the sodium therefore shifts the membrane voltage, and then the calcium gets released. And that obviously can lead to chronic excitation of those neurons, which is not great whatsoever because that can lead to things like neuroinflammation, excitotoxicity, neuronal cell death. And if we look at that on the disease states, that's basically every single neuropsychiatric and neurological disorder that we know of, that there is a component of like the membrane voltages of these neurons, or the voltage of these neurons, should I say, is completely compromised. And that's reflective of how energy is dissipated in the system and how much energy we actually have that can be utilized. So basically, I probably went a little bit deeper in terms of what you were asking, but I think it is a really big deal when we look at calcium. It is like one of
Right.
the biggest signals of cells and neurons.
Yeah. And then I also think of like calcification. So like one of my favorite, well, one of the things I had on a cone beam scan, I had a calcified fungal balls in my sinuses. I had this scan done like, I don't know, 6 years ago. And I was
Wow.
like, why would calcium do that? And then I heard another story that was super wild. Woman in a third world country in her 70s, she like went to a hospital. She looked pregnant. She had abdominal pain, and they found a calcified fetus, 40 years old, in her uterus that had
Wow.
passed away, but calcium protected her from it. So stories like that always make me like wonder like how does calcium know how to do that? Like it's attracted to damage, it's attracted to like because then I think of like calcification of the arteries and things like that. Like are the arteries being damaged and calcium comes to repair it?
So, did you say calcified fungal balls?
Yeah, that's what they said were in my
Interesting.
sinuses. Yeah.
Interesting. So, and that wasn't mistaken with like say, or wasn't connected to something like biofilms?
Well, I mean, this was at a like a biological dentist, and
Okay.
it was a cone beam scan of the mouth, but they got the sinuses in there. And
Okay.
I had chronic sinus issues my whole life, so I was like, oh, that makes sense. That like I would have had a fungal infection, probably biofilms, and calcium
Mm.
came and walled it off for me.
Yeah, that's fascinating. That like, and you could hypothesize that's what's going on. There also is the component that maybe these pathogens are kind of trying to help us out. Where like Candida obviously has trade-offs, right? If we're just using that as an example, in terms of it can spit out ethanol and histamines and other nasty products, but then it may be playing a role in terms of sequestering heavy metals for biofilms, which kind of sounds like they're doing it to protect themselves, and they probably are. But then there's partially the truth that maybe they're doing that to sort of work in synergism with the host, where the host is a little bit compromised around certain things. So interesting theory around it, but with the calcium side of things, like that's crazy for one, like the fetus thing. I had no idea that was even possible. And with the calcium side of things, in terms of calcification, I think it's a bit the term calcification is actually it's quite misleading when you understand the concepts around what is going on inside the blood vessels with that. So obviously there's like plaque from white blood cells like foam cells and even clotting factors like fibrin or fibrinogen or whatever it is. But then the other side of it is that the calcification should actually be called calcium phosphate or calcium phosphication or something because the calcium's always found inside the blood with the phosphates, with phosphorus. And it's when we start to shift that ratio, and it could be connected to someone's diet, it could be the lack, so the lack there of calcium, or also the lack or excessive phosphate, and that's going to drive parathyroid hormone to increase to try and match it together in the blood. But then there's obviously collateral damage around if there's inflammation in the arteries, then the calcification, let's just call it that for now, are calcium phosphate crystal deposits. So that is something that can occur from someone who gets excessive phosphate in their diet, and maybe they lack the ability to regulate the flux in the kidneys. And then we're kind of tying back to energy again, because a lot of what goes on in the kidneys is heavily dependent on mitochondrial function. Like they use, I think, I could be wrong about this, but I think it's somewhere between 5 to 10% of oxygen that the body uses. So just for reference around that, like the brain uses about 20 to 25%. So the kidneys are heavily mitochondrial dependent. They have a ton of blood and filtrate that goes through it daily. And if there is a compromisation there, and it just comes back to energy in terms of regulating what goes into the filtrate and what goes back into the blood and vice versa. So with this calcification, it can be driven directly from that, but then also from like the diet side of things as well. And I wouldn't say like the calcification in the arteries is protective. I will say like the wound healing side of things and the scar tissue seems to be more of a protective factor. But the calcification to me, like the calcium phosphate crystal accumulation, to me, it seems like it's just a dysregulated system. And I should also add to that that if there is a lack of calcium in the diet and there's high phosphorus, then we have to get calcium from somewhere, and obviously we have a huge reserve of calcium in our bone and teeth. So essentially what happens is the calcium via parathyroid gland activity, which again like can upregulate stress hormones as well, like cortisol and prolactin, that will leach calcium from the teeth and bones into the blood. And something crazy is that if you're not eating dairy, it is very hard to get calcium in unless you're eating sardines or eggshell powder. And then for phosphorus, it's very easy to get it in. Everyone's eating a ton of muscle meat now, not balancing it with slow cooked meat. And then at the same time, some people may be having like certain foods that aren't organic, and you could even make the argument there that there's phosphates within that in the herbicides and pesticides. And then also, if we take it a step further, then this is more for the people who are addicted to, say, drinking soda, or I think that's what you call it in America. We call it soft drink, and that can contain highly bioavailable phosphates, and then that within itself can cause huge implications, as I mentioned before. And then you think about this, right? And you hear people with like high blood pressure, because you've got to think if there is this calcification of the arteries or of the blood vessels, depending on what size they are. Therefore, and you would argue that it's probably going to be slightly bigger ones because the smaller ones can regenerate essentially quite easily. But when that essentially happens, then our delivery of oxygen and nutrients to certain tissues is going to be compromised. And you could even make the argument that that could be another driver for something like cancer, where we block off certain nutrients to it. So therefore, the cancer cell is driving up angiogenesis and having all these little blood vessels and just incorporating everything as much as it can to essentially grow and thrive because it's cut off from the rest of the system, basically. So Yeah, those are the things I like to think about when it comes to the whole calcification side of things. And then the other nuance with that is that people love to blame all of this on cholesterol, where cholesterol may not even be the problem in this case. And it could just be related to the calcium phosphorus ratio and the inability to regulate it in the blood. And this is where Ray Peat's work is really good. And I would say out of all of Ray Peat's work, this is the best concepts that he has is around calcium phosphorus ratio. But you can kind of think of that as protective as well, really. Like you could almost say, kind of tying back to what you said, maybe it is protective. Maybe it is tying into the whole vasoconstriction theory I had before, where maybe we are trying to restrict blood flow for a reason of that we're coupling it to how much oxygen we can utilize in the associated substrates that feed into the mitochondria.
Yeah, everything always ties back together. It's like I feel like
Absolutely.
once you get into these cycles, it's like, okay, how do I get out? Right? And I'll meet people, and it just like I've been there myself. It just feels like a freight train that you can't stop. So to kind of tie it together, wrap it up, what are these things that, you know, without testing, like what are those big foundations that you have to start there, you have to do those things, and then you can kind of move into that optimization of like, okay, let's get really targeted nutrients or targeted supplements, but the 80% versus the 20% you were talking about earlier.
Yeah, okay. So the 80% is just so as I said, the 80% is the you can think of it as like the first story of the house. And then the second story of the house is like that 20%. And you can think of it even deeper around that maybe the bedroom's on the second story of the house or something like that. So sure, you can have the foundations there, you can cook, you can watch television, you can study, whatever you want. But then if the second story of the house is compromised, therefore you may not be able to sleep as well as you can, and that can be reflective of your health not being as well as good as it can be. So, and that 20% is basically what I have in school, by the way. So like people post a health journal, they share their labs, their whatever labs they have, their symptoms, like a deep symptom assessment, their micronutrients, and essentially we have to reverse engineer what they fundamentally need, because there's so much information out there that is just around health stuff that no one really knows what they actually need anymore because there's just too much noise. So with the 80%, it's probably going to look a little bit different for each person, in terms of people who have their different ways of thinking about it and what they incorporate. But I do think the core concepts are pretty much the same. So if we look at that, we look at mindset as a really big component here, arguably the biggest component, because it encompasses like it kind of when I think about it, if I give a protocol to someone, the two same people, and let's just say they're doing everything absolutely the same, they're almost identical, except one has like a growth mindset, high amounts of positivity, and then the other one is kind of in like this neurotic, lack of surrender state where they have just like negative thought patterns or something like that, then they're going to get completely different outcomes despite doing everything exactly the same. So mindset is really huge, and that can encompass things like journaling, just positive attitude towards life, religion, and like connection to God, and then breath work, meditation. Then the breathing side of things is equally as important, which we touched on today, which I don't think we need to go too much deeper into, but I mentioned breathwork just then, but it also influences the mind, but breathing within itself. And you could look into things like fascia as well, as a component or an extension of breathing. Then hydration. So as we said, we've got a lot of nuance with hydration here, where sure, we're talking about the water you drink from the outside, but how can we make it on the inside too? So we're looking at both angles around that, like drinking sufficient amount of water, good quality filtered water, uh, ideally mineral water, or having it remineralized, which is reflecting probably what our ancestors drank predominantly. And then like electrolytes and all that kind of stuff, but then everything that we spoke about today. And then you could even take you could go another layer deeper around water absorption, how that's regulated in the large bowel, the nerves that innervate that, the inflammation that may affect, or the dysbiosis that may affect the actual absorption of that. So, again, going a little bit deeper. Then there's light and sleep. So I think they tie in with one another, but light is obviously getting probably around 90 to 120 minutes of sunlight a day, whether that's direct or indirect. It really depends. Then pure darkness at night or close to it, so candlelight or red light, mitigation of non-native EMFs, and then this sort of funnels into sleep where we have optimal sleep hygiene, uh, avoiding light pollution at night, sleeping on like a good quality mattress and good quality materials that is not polyester or something like that. Like all of these things are really important for sleep, eye mask, whatever you essentially need to do. And then we can obviously get into the specifics around, for me, like obviously with the sleep apnea, I'm going a little bit deeper around chewing ice cubes before bed sometimes, or um, doing using mouth tape or even nasal tape occasionally, earplugs because my girlfriend snores as well, ironically. So it's just like doing stuff like that, depending on what you need. Then another one is nutrition, which again can be seasonal, but then I think it has to be more specific for each individual, especially if there is chronic issues. But then on top of that is like layering on the micronutrients and ensure that you're saturating. Then it's movement. So low intensity, high intensity, resistance training, like flexibility, mobility, fascia, like all of these things are incorporated, even lymphatic work as well, which is probably should be higher on the list. It almost deserves its own like fundamental concepts, to be honest with you, because it is so important. And then connection to nature. So whether that if you're in a city, can you get to a park? Can you ground? Can you go on a hike on the weekend? Or are you living somewhere where you have like an abundance of nature surrounding you? Which fortunately, like myself, I have access to a beach. There's beautiful greenery everywhere. So I somewhat have access to that. This depends on the level and scale of what it looks like for you. And then the last thing is connection. So relationships, friendships, family, like how much do you need in terms of like your social life that positively influences you. And obviously we can go back to the analogy I had where, well, not analogy, just like a time in my life where I was on an island completely isolated, and that had a huge effect on my health. So really important as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah, I love it. I kind of see these things as like a piece of, I call it a healing pie, where all of these things are going to affect all the other ones eventually. So you have to figure out like how big is this piece for you? How big is that piece for you? And lean into those like when you kind of need to, and always kind of come back to like the easiest, simplest things, which is like light, water, connection, sleep, love, like that kind of stuff will get you further than what I think people get really like obsessed with is those specific protocols and going practitioner to practitioner, but they fail to see that they're in a toxic job or a toxic relationship, or they, are on a computer all day, just simple things like that. So I appreciate all of your very detailed explanations. I love how you have all these pathways memorized and just can like spit them out from memory. It's really impressive. And again, I want to direct everyone to your school, so I'll put a link in the show notes. But can you tell everyone where to find you, like on social media and your website and all that?
Yep. So Instagram is Jack Schroder underscore. X is Jack underscore Schroder underscore. And that's SCHRODER because it's very commonly misspelt. And then jackschroder.com is my website. And then school community is school.com/health optimization, which is the main platform that I'm active on and doing my health coaching and protocols for people inside there and education for practitioners.
Yeah, awesome. All right, Jack, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for listening. I will see you all next time. Thank you, everyone. I am just so thrilled that you're listening to the Healer Revolution podcast. This has been a huge passion project for me and super therapeutic on top of that, helping me to use my voice and connect with other like-minded individuals. So if you're enjoying the podcast, please like and subscribe. Please share on social media or with your audience or friends or loved ones. I truly appreciate it. It does take a lot of time and financial costs to run the podcast, and it is not a moneymaker, let me tell you. So if you are enjoying this, I would truly appreciate your support just by sending me a post, a like, and a subscribe. Thank you so much.